It started the night I moved into apartment 3B. The place was cheap, too cheap, but after months of searching, I convinced myself that the cracked paint and stale air were just part of its old charm. The landlord smiled a little too long when handing over the keys, his fingers trembling slightly, but I was too tired to care. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the stillness. Not silence, stillness. Like the air was holding its breath. The first few nights passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the sense that the walls were listening. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the click of the light switch, seemed to echo just a little too long. On the fourth night, as I lay half asleep, a soft knock came from the wall beside my bed. I froze. Then came another, slow and deliberate, like someone tapping from the other side. I told myself it was just pipes or the building settling. Old places make old noises. But when the whisper followed a faint, dragging sound like someone mouthing words through plaster, I couldn't explain it away. Days later, I found something wedged behind the bathroom cabinet, a small, tattered notebook. The pages were yellow, soaked with what looked like old water stains. The handwriting grew more frantic with each entry. "It doesn't stop," one line read. "It knows when I'm awake." The last page simply said, "Don't listen." I dropped the book and tried to laugh it off, but when night fell again, the knocking returned, louder this time, impatient. By the seventh night, I had had enough. I pressed my ear against the wall, listening. Something moved inside, slow, shifting, alive. I sealed the vent with tape and pushed my dresser against the wall, thinking that would be the end of it. But the sound didn't stop. It changed. The knocking turned into scratching, like nails dragging down wood, and then, silence. That's when it whispered my name. Clearly. Slowly. From inside the wall. The story begins when the narrator moves into an old, crumbling apartment building that sits at the edge of a quiet street, half forgotten by the city. It was one of those places that looked normal enough from the outside but carried a heavy air of something unspoken. The building's paint peeled like dead skin, and its windows reflected nothing but the grey of the sky. Yet for someone desperate for a place to live, its price was irresistible. The rent was suspiciously low, almost unnervingly so, as if the landlord simply wanted it occupied, no questions asked. The narrator didn't think twice, convincing themselves that the building's age was the reason for the low cost. They ignored the faint unease that tugged at them while signing the lease, mistaking it for nerves that come with any big change. The landlord was a thin, pale man with watery eyes and a faint smile that never reached them. His hands trembled slightly as he handed over the keys, his gaze flickering toward the third floor before quickly looking away. When the narrator mentioned the apartment number, 3B, he hesitated just for a second too long before muttering, "You'll be fine there. It's quiet." That word, quiet, seemed to hang in the air like a warning disguised as reassurance. Carrying their few belongings up the dim stairwell, the narrator noticed that each step groaned underfoot, and the walls seemed to hum faintly, like there was something alive behind them. The hall lights flickered every few seconds, though the landlord had claimed the wiring was recently redone. Inside the apartment, the air felt colder than it should have, even for an old building. The rooms smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, almost like rust. Dust clung to every surface, and the floorboards creaked with each step, responding to even the slightest movement as though they remembered every foot that had walked there before. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, the narrator told themselves it was perfect, a blank slate, a chance to start over. But the silence was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It wasn't peaceful or comforting. It was thick, heavy, and watchful, pressing against their ears in the moments between each breath. At night, that silence deepened. The building seemed to settle around them, sighing and whispering through the pipes. Shadows stretched longer than they should, shifting subtly when the lights went out. Though exhaustion eventually pulled them into sleep, a faint sense of being observed lingered in the corners of the room. The narrator brushed it off as nerves, unaware that this strange, deceptive stillness was the first sign that something beneath the surface of apartment 3B had been waiting for a very long time. As the nights passed, the unsettling quiet of apartment 3B began to change. What was once merely stillness evolved into something deliberate, something that seemed aware of the narrator's presence. It started subtly, a faint tapping sound that came from behind the bedroom wall late at night, rhythmic but irregular, like someone gently knocking to test if they were awake. At first, the narrator dismissed it as pipes or the creaks of an aging building, but the sound always came at the same hour, just past midnight, and always from the same spot beside the bed. The more they tried to ignore it, the more distinct it became, each knock separated by a long, patient pause, as though whoever or whatever was on the other side was waiting for a response. After several nights, the knocking was joined by whispers. They weren't loud enough to form words, but their tone carried a strange urgency, rising and falling as if part of a conversation. The whispers seemed to slide through the plaster, faint but unmistakably close. The narrator would lie perfectly still, straining to listen, their breath shallow and heart pounding in their throat. Once, when the sound came too near, they whispered a shaky hello, into the darkness, instantly regretting it. The whispers stopped, followed by a silence so sharp it felt alive. A few seconds later, the knock came again, this time, twice as hard. During the day, everything felt normal. The building was quiet, the neighbors polite but distant, and the sunlight streaming through the grimy windows made it easy to believe it had all been imagination. But as soon as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the strange sounds returned. Some nights, it was scratching, faint and slow, like nails dragging across wood. Other times, it was a low hum, deep within the walls, vibrating through the floorboards. No matter how loud the narrator turned up the television or how tightly they stuffed their ears with cotton, the noises found their way through. Sleep became difficult. The narrator began waking up to the sense of movement in the apartment, the soft shift of air, the faintest impression of footsteps fading away down the hall. They even thought they saw a shadow slip out of sight in the corner of their vision, though every time they looked, there was nothing but emptiness. The worst part was that no one else seemed to notice. When they mentioned it to the landlord, he only smiled that same uneasy smile and said, "Old buildings like to talk." But this wasn't the sound of a building settling. This was something intelligent. Something waiting. And with every passing night, it was getting bolder, pushing closer, testing the thin barrier between the walls and the world of the living. The growing unease in the apartment finally drove the narrator to search for answers, desperate to prove that what they were hearing had a rational explanation. They began asking subtle questions around the building, hoping to uncover something that could make sense of the strange noises and whispers that filled the nights. Most tenants avoided eye contact, brushing off any mention of apartment 3B with awkward smiles or hasty goodbyes. One older woman who lived down the hall looked visibly shaken when the narrator mentioned where they stayed. She muttered that no one lasts long there before retreating into her apartment, locking the door behind her. The words echoed in the narrator's mind for days. It wasn't until they decided to explore their own apartment more thoroughly that the first real clue appeared. Behind the bathroom cabinet, hidden beneath a loose panel, the narrator found a small leather-bound notebook covered in dust and mold. The edges of the pages were brittle, darkened by dampness, and the ink had bled in places as though it had been exposed to water or perhaps something else. The handwriting inside began neat and measured, but as the entries went on, the writing turned erratic and uneven. It belonged to the apartment's previous tenant, a woman named Claire, whose name appeared on a yellowed piece of mail the narrator had found weeks earlier in the kitchen drawer. The early pages described her excitement at moving in, her delight at finding such an affordable place in a decent neighborhood. But halfway through the notebook, the tone changed. Her entries became frantic, full of fear and sleeplessness. She wrote about the same sounds, the knocking, the whispers, the scratching that grew louder every night. Claire wrote that she tried to speak to the landlord, but he only told her she was imagining things. Her final entries were almost unreadable, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It's behind the wall," one page said. "It wants to be heard." The next few entries were just repetitions of the same phrases: "Don't answer, don't listen, it knows my name." The last page was the most disturbing of all. The ink had smeared as if the page was written in a panic, and it read, "It's not the building. It's what the building was built over. I can hear it breathing." After that, the diary ended abruptly, no date, no closure, just silence. When the narrator tried to look up Claire's name in public records, they found nothing, no forwarding address, no record of her moving out. It was as if she had vanished completely. The discovery left a chill that no amount of reasoning could shake, because now the whispers in the wall didn't just sound random, they sounded like they were calling for whoever came after her. After discovering the diary and realizing that the previous tenant had experienced the same haunting sounds, the narrator's fear turned into desperate determination. They decided to confront whatever was happening instead of running from it. Each night, the noises seemed to grow more aggressive, the knocking echoing through the walls as if the unseen thing behind them knew it was being acknowledged. The whispers came more frequently now, low and distorted, threading through the silence like a language just out of reach. The narrator began to notice cold spots in the apartment, patches of air so icy that their breath would fog even though the heater was on. It felt as though the entire place was alive, pulsing faintly with some hidden rhythm beneath the surface. One night, unable to bear it any longer, the narrator traced the sound to its source, the old air vent in the bedroom wall. The metal grill was covered in layers of dust, and when they pressed their ear close, a faint wheezing sound came from within, something that almost resembled breathing. For hours, they sat there listening, frozen between disbelief and dread, until the breathing suddenly stopped. Then came a slow drag, like fingernails scraping down metal from deep inside. The narrator screamed and stumbled back, shaking uncontrollably. When the sound didn't return, they convinced themselves that blocking the vent might help. Maybe it was just rats, or wind, or their imagination feeding on fear. They sealed the vent with duct tape, cardboard, and heavy furniture, trying to close off any possible source of sound. For a few moments, the silence that followed felt like relief. But as the minutes passed, the air in the room thickened, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. Then came the first knock, deafening, sharp, and angry. It wasn't the soft tapping from before. It was violent, demanding, and it came from multiple places at once: the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. The apartment shook with it, picture frames rattling, dust falling from the corners. The narrator pressed their back against the door, terrified to move, and the knocking grew faster, louder, until suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with an unnatural stillness that made their skin crawl. For the first time, the narrator realized that the sounds weren't random, they were reactions. The thing inside the walls had noticed the blockage, and now it was angry. The next night, when they dared to enter the bedroom again, the vent covering was gone, the tape peeled clean off, as though something from inside had removed it piece by piece while they slept. The night everything changed began like all the others, thick with unease and the constant hum of something unseen pressing against the edges of silence. After sealing the vent and finding it mysteriously unsealed the next morning, the narrator felt watched every second they spent inside the apartment. Every creak of the floorboards and flicker of light made their heart race. Sleep had become impossible. They tried keeping music on through the night, but even then, faint knocks slipped through the noise, perfectly timed between each song, as if the thing in the wall was waiting for quiet moments to make itself known. Soon, the knocking stopped being confined to one place, it spread across the apartment. Sometimes it came from the kitchen, other times from the bathroom, and once, terrifyingly, from directly beneath their bed. Each sound carried a strange intelligence behind it, almost like it was communicating in a rhythm only it understood. Then came the silence. After nights of relentless disturbances, the apartment went completely still. Not even the wind seemed to move outside. For the first time in weeks, the narrator thought maybe it was over. They moved cautiously through the rooms, whispering to themselves that maybe the thing had gone, maybe the haunting had ended. But the quiet didn't feel like peace, it felt like waiting. That night, as they lay in bed staring at the ceiling, they realized the silence was wrong. It wasn't natural. It was too perfect, as though the entire building was listening for something. Their ears rang in the stillness, their breathing loud against the dark. Then, from inside the wall, came the sound of a single, drawn-out exhale. The narrator froze, unable to move or scream. The air felt heavy, thick with dread. Then came a voice, soft, hoarse, and terrifyingly close. It whispered their full name, slowly, syllable by syllable, from deep inside the wall where the knocking had once been. The sound of it was unlike anything human. It was too precise, too deliberate, as if it had practiced saying their name over and over again. The voice repeated it a second time, this time quieter, almost tender, like it was savoring the familiarity of it. Every instinct screamed to run, but the narrator's body refused to respond. The wall seemed to breathe again, expanding and contracting as though something massive was just beyond the surface. Then the plaster cracked, a faint line crawling across the wall right where the sound was strongest. The whisper stopped, replaced by a faint scraping noise from within, like long nails dragging down wood. The narrator backed away slowly, never taking their eyes off the wall, realizing that whatever had been behind it all along didn't just know they were there, it knew who they were. The moment the wall whispered the narrator's name, everything inside apartment 3B changed. The boundaries between the familiar and the unknown began to blur, and the apartment felt less like a home and more like a living thing watching its tenant unravel. The next morning, sunlight did little to chase away the dread. The cracks that had formed on the wall remained, faint but unmistakably new, crawling like veins across the plaster. The narrator couldn't bring themselves to touch them. They sensed something beyond that thin layer of wall, something awake, something patient. Every sound, even the distant footsteps of neighbors, seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. The building had gone unnaturally quiet, like everyone inside had learned to move without making noise. That day, the narrator tried to leave, but the moment they reached the door, a deep, resonant vibration pulsed through the floorboards. The sound was low and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat coming from below. It wasn't just noise, they could feel it in their chest, in their bones, as though the entire structure was breathing. Fear held them in place, paralyzing their body while their mind screamed to run. When the vibration stopped, they flung the door open, only to find the hallway lights flickering violently, the air colder than outside. The elevator stood open at the end of the hall, its interior pitch black despite the light from the corridor. Something about that darkness made their skin crawl. It wasn't empty, it was watching. Retreating back inside, they locked the door, sliding down against it as exhaustion finally gave way to panic. The walls began to groan again, a long, drawn-out creak that moved from one side of the apartment to the other, like something was crawling slowly through the hollow spaces. They pressed their ear against the floor and heard a faint dragging sound beneath them, heavy and wet, followed by what sounded like faint breathing, this time closer, clearer, as though the thing had moved directly under the apartment. The faint smell of decay began to seep through the cracks in the floor, filling the room with a sharp, metallic scent. As night fell, the lights flickered again, and the knocking returned, soft at first, then escalating until it shook the walls. The narrator backed into a corner, shaking, their eyes fixed on the spreading cracks in the plaster. Then, in the dark, the voice returned, this time from multiple directions at once, whispering their name in overlapping tones, distorted but unmistakably intimate. It didn't sound angry anymore, it sounded amused. The walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whisper, as if the building itself was alive and closing in, feeding off their fear. By the time the voices surrounded the narrator, reality itself had begun to unravel. Days and nights blended together in a haze of exhaustion and fear, with no clear sense of when one ended and the other began. The apartment no longer felt like a place bound by walls but a maze that breathed and shifted in rhythm with something unseen. The air was always cold now, thick with the stench of rot that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The narrator barely ate, barely slept, and the once familiar sound of their own heartbeat had become drowned out by the faint, rhythmic tapping that never truly stopped. Sometimes it came from above, other times from inside the floor, and occasionally from right behind their headboard, soft and deliberate, as if marking time until something inevitable arrived. The diary of the previous tenant lay open on the table, its final words burned into their mind. Every night, they found themselves staring at that last page. It's not the building. It's what the building was built over. Those words looped endlessly in their thoughts, connecting to the strange, earthy smell that had grown stronger in the apartment. They began to notice damp stains spreading across the walls, dark and irregular, resembling handprints that slowly multiplied as the days went on. The narrator tried cleaning them off, but the stains only deepened, as if the wall itself was absorbing the effort. Then came the dreams, or what felt like dreams. They began waking up in the middle of the night, standing in places they didn't remember walking to, staring at the wall where the cracks had widened. Sometimes they woke to the sound of their own voice whispering words they didn't recognize. The line between sleeping and waking blurred until they couldn't tell which version of themselves was real. In those moments, the whispers no longer came from beyond the wall but from inside their own head, echoing in the same distorted tone that had once called their name. One night, the knocking stopped altogether. The silence that followed was so complete that even the hum of electricity seemed to vanish. The air felt hollow, void of life, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long across the floor. When they turned toward the wall, the cracks had widened into thin, jagged openings, just wide enough to see movement within. Something shifted behind them, slow and deliberate, pressing against the surface from the inside. The narrator's breath hitched as the faint outline of a hand pushed outward from the plaster, its fingers dragging along the wall as if searching for a way through. The final whisper came then, not from the wall, but from directly behind their ear, so close they could feel the breath against their skin, whispering softly, "You opened the door." The moment the whisper came from behind their ear, the last thread of reality the narrator was clinging to began to unravel completely. The apartment was no longer a place of walls and rooms but a trap that pulsed with an unnatural life of its own. The air had grown unbearably heavy, thick with a stench of wet earth and decay that clung to every breath. Every surface in the apartment seemed to hum with low vibrations, faintly trembling as though something massive moved deep beneath the floor. The lights flickered in a slow, steady rhythm, dimming in sync with the narrator's heartbeat. When they tried to leave, the door refused to open, the handle rattling uselessly in their shaking hand. No matter how hard they pulled, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the apartment itself wanted them to stay. The cracks on the wall now stretched from floor to ceiling, branching like veins, their edges pulsing faintly in the dim light. From within them came faint noises, wet, slithering movements and the low moan of something trying to speak through layers of stone and wood. The narrator stumbled backward, pressing themselves against the far wall, trembling uncontrollably. The air grew colder until their breath became visible, yet sweat dripped from their forehead as the oppressive atmosphere pressed closer. The voices began again, whispering their name over and over, overlapping, growing louder until the room was filled with a chorus of distorted murmurs. Some sounded pleading, others mocking, all too human to be ignored. When the cracks widened further, a faint light began to seep through, not warm or bright, but pale and sickly, casting shifting shadows that danced across the walls. The narrator watched in horror as a shape began to form behind the plaster, its outline human but its movements unnatural, jerking and twisting as though it were struggling to remember how to exist in this world. A hand burst through first, grey and mottled, followed by another, both clawing at the air as the wall buckled outward. The voice that had whispered their name returned, clearer now, deeper, resonating from inside the walls themselves. It spoke not with anger but with eerie calm, as if claiming something that had always belonged to it. The narrator tried to scream, but no sound came. The apartment trembled violently, dust falling from the ceiling as the cracks spread wider, connecting into a single gaping wound in the wall. A freezing wind poured through it, carrying the faint sound of distant cries and the scent of damp soil. As the figure began to pull itself through, its face pressed against the opening, pale and half-formed, the narrator finally understood that the building wasn't haunted, it was hungry, and it had been waiting for someone to take her place. The moment the pale figure began forcing itself through the wall, the world inside the apartment seemed to dissolve into chaos. The walls shuddered violently as cracks split open in every direction, releasing gusts of air that smelled of rot and something far older than the building itself. The narrator stumbled backward, eyes fixed on the thing emerging from the plaster. Its body was warped, twisting as though it were made of smoke and flesh at once, shifting between solid and transparent in the flickering light. Its face was featureless except for deep, hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. The sound it made was low and guttural, a vibration that rattled through the floorboards and into the narrator's bones. They tried to run, but every door they reached swung shut on its own, slamming with a force that shook the walls. The apartment no longer obeyed the laws of the world outside, it had become something alive, something sentient, holding them inside like prey in a trap. The figure continued to push through, the sound of tearing wood and cracking plaster echoing in the room. Behind it, the wall seemed to open wider, revealing a darkness that pulsed faintly as though it were breathing. Within that void were faint shapes, shifting and twitching, countless outlines pressing forward like things desperate to escape. The voices that had haunted the narrator's nights returned, louder now, clearer, some crying for help, others laughing in tones that sent shivers down their spine. It was no longer a haunting, it was a revelation. Every person who had ever vanished from that apartment, every tenant who had heard the whispers, was still there, trapped behind the walls, their souls absorbed into whatever lay beneath the building. The narrator's vision began to blur as the temperature dropped sharply. Frost crawled across the windows from the inside, and their breath came in ragged gasps. The creature's arm reached fully through the wall now, stretching longer than any human limb should, its fingers grazing the air just inches from the narrator's face. The voice spoke again, softer this time, in a tone that almost sounded familiar. It wasn't calling their name anymore, it was speaking through it, twisting it, as if using their identity as a key. The walls began to close in, the sound of movement growing louder all around, like dozens of hands dragging themselves closer. As the figure leaned forward, its hollow face inches away, the whispers overlapped into a deafening hum, and the narrator understood the horrifying truth. The apartment hadn't trapped them by accident, it had chosen them. The realization that the apartment had chosen them was the final descent into terror. The narrator stood frozen as the walls pulsed and groaned around them, the entire building seeming to draw breath in unison with the creature now almost completely free from the cracked plaster. Its face shifted constantly, forming and reforming features that seemed borrowed, eyes that looked familiar, a mouth that mimicked the narrator's own expression of fear, skin that flickered between the pale gray of death and the sickly warmth of something living. It didn't simply emerge from the wall, it grew out of it, as though it had always been part of the structure, molded by every whisper, every fear, every sleepless night. The air was thick with the stench of rot and mold, and the temperature dropped until frost bloomed on the walls. The sound of whispering was no longer confined to one voice. Hundreds of voices filled the space, overlapping in a distorted harmony that made the narrator's head spin. Some begged to be freed, while others urged the creature onward, chanting words that made no sense yet filled the room with suffocating dread. The figure finally stepped fully into the room, dragging with it strands of wet plaster and dirt that fell to the floor like pieces of its old prison. It stood taller than the narrator, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, its movements disjointed but purposeful. Every step it took left a faint imprint on the floor, as though the wood beneath its feet softened at its touch. The narrator backed into the corner, their heart hammering so violently that they could feel it echoing in their ears. The creature tilted its head, studying them with a slow, unnatural curiosity. When it spoke, its voice wasn't loud, it was a whisper layered with echoes, as though 100 mouths were speaking at once through it. "You heard us," it said. "You listened." The words weren't accusatory, they were pleased, as if the narrator had fulfilled some unspoken contract by acknowledging the presence behind the wall. The room began to darken as the lights flickered one final time and went out completely. The only illumination came from the faint, pulsing glow that seeped through the cracks in the walls. The creature reached out its hand, not in attack but in invitation, its fingers stretching toward the narrator's chest. When it touched them, the cold burned through their skin, freezing their breath in their throat. In that instant, the voices fell silent, and the walls around them began to close inward, the cracks sealing as the creature's hand passed straight through their body. There was no pain, only an overwhelming stillness, as if the apartment itself had inhaled deeply and refused to let go. The moment the creature's hand passed through the narrator's chest, the world seemed to collapse inward, folding in on itself in slow, suffocating waves. The air thickened until breathing felt impossible, and the walls groaned as though the entire building were alive and straining against something it could no longer contain. Every sound vanished, the hum of electricity, the creak of wood, even the narrator's own heartbeat faded into the stillness. They tried to move, but their body no longer obeyed. It felt as though invisible hands were pressing against them from all directions, holding them still while something cold and immense slid beneath their skin. A crushing sense of familiarity filled them, a realization that the whispers had never been separate from them at all, they had been slowly merging, drawing closer with every night spent listening. The voices were no longer coming from the walls. They were inside. The apartment began to change around them. The furniture warped and melted into the floor, the walls stretched and pulsed like muscle, and the faint glow that seeped through the cracks turned blood red. The air vibrated with low, mournful tones that weren't quite sound but could be felt deep in the chest. The figure that had emerged from the wall no longer stood apart. Its form was dissolving, merging with the apartment as if it were returning home. Its eyes, if they could still be called that, glowed faintly, reflecting the narrator's own face, their expression frozen in silent terror. As the creature's shape faded, the voices returned, whispering softly, repeating the same words again and again. "You belong here now." The narrator stumbled toward the door, their movements sluggish as though wading through water. But when they touched the handle, it crumbled into dust beneath their fingers. The wood of the door had become soft, pulsing faintly, alive. Every attempt to escape was met with resistance. The windows were no longer windows but dark mirrors reflecting the faint outline of the room itself. Behind each reflection, figures moved in the shadows, faces of those who had come before, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. The realization struck like a knife. Every soul that had vanished in the building had not left. They were absorbed, fused into the walls, into the heartbeat of the structure that fed on fear and memory. As the last of the red light dimmed, the narrator felt their mind slipping. The whispers turned gentle, soothing, lulling them into submission as their body began to dissolve into the cold, breathing walls. In the final moments before the darkness swallowed them completely, they heard one last knock echo from deep within the building, slow, deliberate, and patient, waiting for the next tenant to move in. The building was silent again. The once frantic whispers, the pounding knocks, the scraping behind the walls, all had faded into a deep, eerie calm. Days, or what felt like days, passed in stillness. The air hung motionless, thick with the faint scent of dust and decay. Apartment 3B stood empty, its door slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness spilling into the hallway. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, unchanged, as if nothing unnatural had ever taken place within its walls. The landlord, moving with his usual slow caution, finally climbed the stairs after receiving complaints about a strange odor coming from the third floor. His hand hesitated on the doorknob, trembling just as it had when he first handed the keys to the narrator. He pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned, releasing a faint gust of stale, cold air. Inside, the apartment looked abandoned. A thin layer of dust covered every surface, and the curtains hung stiff with age. The furniture sat exactly where it had always been, yet something about the space felt wrong, as if the room itself were breathing beneath the silence. The landlord stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under his shoes. He called out the tenant's name once, twice, but his voice fell flat, swallowed by the air before it could echo. The faint traces of footprints led to the bedroom, ending abruptly near the wall where the old vent had once been. The vent was gone now, sealed over with fresh plaster, smooth and flawless, except for a faint outline in the shape of a hand pressed into the surface. The landlord froze. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, his breath fogging in front of him. A soft vibration hummed through the floor, subtle but unmistakable, like a slow, steady heartbeat coming from deep below. He backed away, muttering a prayer under his breath, but before he could reach the door, a faint sound echoed through the apartment, a single knock from inside the wall. It was quiet, almost gentle, but deliberate enough to stop him cold. He turned slowly, staring at the plaster. Another knock followed, louder this time, closer. Then came a faint whisper, so soft he almost thought he imagined it, a voice that carried the rhythm of his own name. His eyes darted to the ceiling where the cracks were beginning to spread again, thin and spider-like, crawling outward in all directions. The faint sound of movement stirred behind the walls, slow and restless, as if the apartment was waking from a long sleep. The landlord stepped back into the hall, slamming the door shut behind him, but even from outside, he could still hear it, the steady, patient knocking continuing from deep within apartment 3B, waiting for someone new to answer. Weeks passed, and the building fell back into its familiar rhythm of quiet neglect. New tenants came and went on the other floors, unaware of the silence that lingered around apartment 3B. The landlord avoided that part of the hallway entirely, keeping the door locked and the keys buried deep in his desk drawer. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, there were nights when he could swear he heard faint murmurs seeping through the walls, a voice or two calling from behind the sealed plaster. He told himself it was nothing, just the wind, the pipes, the ordinary sounds of an old building. Yet, when the temperature would drop for no reason or the lights in the corridor flickered at the exact same time every night, a part of him knew something was still alive in there, waiting. One evening, a young woman arrived at the building, suitcase in hand and hope in her eyes. She had answered a small, poorly written ad for a cheap studio apartment in the heart of the city. The landlord hesitated when she mentioned the address, 3B, but before he could explain, she insisted she needed a place immediately, anywhere quiet where she could work. After a long silence, he handed her the keys, though his hand trembled slightly as he did. "If you hear anything strange," he muttered, "just ignore it." She smiled politely, not understanding the weight behind his words, and disappeared up the stairs. When she unlocked the door, the smell of old dust and stagnant air greeted her. The room was dim, the light bulb flickering faintly as if uncertain it wanted to stay lit. Still, she unpacked her things, brushed the dust from the shelves, and opened the window to let the night breeze in. Everything seemed fine, quiet, even peaceful until she noticed the faint outline of a handprint on the far wall. It was barely visible in the fading light, but she felt an odd pull toward it, an inexplicable urge to trace it with her fingers. The moment she did, a shiver ran through her body, and the air around her thickened. Somewhere behind her, a soft creak echoed, though no one else was there. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, the slow, rhythmic knock. Once, twice, 3 times. It came from the same wall she had touched earlier. She turned on the lamp, her heart pounding, but the sound stopped. Then came a whisper, so close to her ear that she froze mid-breath. It was faint, familiar somehow, as though someone was speaking from deep inside the wall itself. And though she couldn't make out the words, one thing was certain: the apartment had found its new voice. The young woman tried to convince herself that the sounds were nothing more than her imagination, an old building settling, pipes expanding and contracting through the night. But deep down, she knew what she had heard wasn't mechanical or random. It carried rhythm, intent, and something disturbingly human about it. For the next few nights, she ignored the noises, wearing earphones and playing soft music to drown them out. Yet, no matter how loud the music, the knocking always found its way through, perfectly timed between songs or during moments of silence. Sometimes it was faint, other times it came in sudden bursts, echoing from different parts of the room as though something or someone was moving within the walls. Sleep became impossible. The exhaustion began to show in her eyes, her movements slower, her speech distracted as if something was quietly eating away at her peace of mind. One night, after another series of knocks, she stood in front of the wall and whispered, "What do you want?" For a long moment, there was no response. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against her chest. Then, slowly, letters began to form on the wall, not written but emerging as faint impressions, as though being pushed outward from the inside. The message was incomplete, but one word stood out clearly: stay. Her stomach turned cold. She stumbled back, tripping over the rug, her gaze fixed on the wall as the letters faded again, leaving no trace behind. She grabbed her phone, but when she tried to record, the camera flickered violently, showing static and flashes of distorted faces that didn't belong to her reflection. The air in the apartment grew denser as the days went on. Objects shifted slightly from where she left them. Her mirror fogged even when the air was cool. At times, faint whispers drifted from behind her, voices that spoke too softly to understand yet clearly too close to be distant. Then came the dreams, vivid, suffocating visions of being trapped inside the walls, unable to scream, her hands clawing at the plaster as shadows pressed in from all sides. Every time she woke, she could still feel the cold of the wall on her fingertips. By the end of the week, she decided to leave. She packed hastily, throwing her belongings into bags without care, desperate to escape the growing dread that clung to her. But when she tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The knob twisted freely, but the door itself remained fixed, as if fused to the frame. From behind the wall came a soft whisper, her own voice repeating, "Stay," drawn out in the same rhythm as the knocks that had haunted her since the first night. Panic set in as the young woman pulled and kicked at the door, her heartbeat echoing louder than the thudding sounds that had begun once again within the walls. Every breath came out sharp and uneven, her vision blurring as fear wrapped its hands around her throat. She ran to the window, but when she tried to open it, the latch snapped clean off, and the glass refused to move. It was as if the apartment itself had sealed her in. The temperature dropped rapidly, her breath forming clouds in the air, and a low hum began vibrating through the floorboards, a deep, resonant sound that felt like a pulse. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the room into thick darkness. For a few seconds, she stood still, the sound of her own breathing the only proof she was still alive. Then came the whisper again, closer this time, directly beside her ear. She turned sharply, her phone flashlight shaking in her trembling hand. The beam caught the surface of the wall, and what she saw made her stomach twist. The plaster was moving. It rippled and flexed like flesh, faint handprints pressing outward as though something underneath was struggling to push through. Faces began to form within the shifting texture, eyes, mouths, distorted features frozen mid-scream before melting back into the surface. The air filled with faint murmurs, hundreds of voices overlapping, each whispering something different yet all filled with the same pleading tone. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest as the whispers grew louder, forming a collective chant that filled the entire apartment. Her flashlight flickered, the battery dying, and in that final flash of light, she saw it, her own reflection staring back at her from within the wall, eyes wide with terror, mouth moving silently as if begging her to run. She dropped the phone and screamed, but no sound came out. Her voice was gone, stolen by the suffocating air that thickened around her. The apartment groaned violently, the walls expanding and contracting like lungs. Cracks formed along the ceiling, releasing a strange, dark mist that filled the space. She tried to reach the door again, but her movements felt sluggish, like she was wading through water. Then, from behind her, a shadow peeled itself from the wall, tall and shapeless, moving with deliberate slowness. Its face was a blur, shifting constantly as if made from every reflection that had ever stared into the room. The voices went silent all at once, replaced by a deep, drawn-out exhale that rattled the floor. The last thing she felt was a cold hand resting gently on her shoulder before the darkness swallowed her completely, and the apartment fell silent once more. The following morning, the hallway outside apartment 3B was quiet except for the faint hum of a broken light bulb flickering overhead. The landlord stood at the base of the stairs, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Something felt off again, that same heavy stillness that had filled the air the last time a tenant had disappeared. He hadn't heard from the young woman in days, and her rent payment, which she'd promised to drop off, never came. He tried to convince himself she'd moved out quietly during the night, but deep down he knew better. The faint scent of something metallic hung in the air, iron, dust, and something older, something that made his throat tighten. Against his better judgment, he made his way up the stairs, each step creaking as if warning him to turn back. When he reached the door, he noticed the faint outline of a handprint near the handle, identical to the one he'd seen months ago before sealing the wall. He hesitated, listening. The hallway was silent, but the silence was too complete, unnatural. Finally, he inserted the key and turned it, but the lock didn't click. The door swung open on its own, releasing a cold gust that extinguished the hallway light completely. Inside, the apartment was untouched, everything in perfect order, except for the faint trail of dark stains leading from the center of the room to the wall where the vent had once been. The smell was stronger now, sweet and suffocating. He called out the woman's name, his voice trembling, echoing weakly before fading into the stillness. Then, a soft creak came from behind the wall, followed by a single knock. His heart pounded as he stepped closer, and his breath came out in sharp, visible clouds. The plaster looked new again, smooth and almost glossy, but as he reached out to touch it, the surface felt warm, almost alive. Beneath his fingertips, he could feel faint vibrations, like a heartbeat pulsing steadily within. He stepped back, his chest tightening as faint whispers began to rise, muffled but growing clearer. They weren't random sounds this time, they were words. Dozens of overlapping voices whispering his name in perfect unison. He stumbled toward the door, but before he could escape, the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a slow, dragging scrape moving across the floor from somewhere behind the wall. His eyes darted toward the plaster just as a faint shadow appeared beneath the surface, shifting as if something large was turning toward him. The wall bulged outward for an instant, then went still. The landlord dropped the keys, backing out of the room with shaking hands. As he slammed the door shut, The single knock returned, soft, patient, deliberate, echoing through the hallway as if the apartment was still calling for someone to come back. After that day, apartment 3B was sealed for good. The landlord nailed heavy boards over the door, painted them shut, and hung a sign that read unsafe, do not enter. No one questioned it. The building's tenants avoided that section of the hallway altogether, lowering their voices whenever they passed by. Yet despite their efforts to forget, the apartment refused to stay silent. Late at night, those who lived closest to it claimed to hear soft tapping from behind the boards, like knuckles brushing lightly against wood. Others swore they caught faint whispers leaking through the cracks, fragments of conversations that made no sense but always ended with a single, drawn-out word, stay. Some tenants moved out suddenly, leaving behind furniture and belongings as if escaping something unseen. The landlord replaced them again and again, but none lasted long. It was as if the building itself was slowly emptying, one tenant at a time, consumed by the same quiet dread that had haunted the place for years. One stormy evening, the electricity flickered throughout the entire building. The lights dimmed, the air thickened, and a low hum resonated through the pipes. When the landlord went to check the breakers, he noticed a thin trail of water running from the ceiling directly above the sealed apartment. The boards over the door were damp, and beneath them came a faint glow, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. He stood frozen, his hand hovering just above the doorknob, though he hadn't touched it in months. As thunder cracked outside, the glow brightened, and a faint sound drifted through the boards, breathing. Slow, labored, and impossibly deep. Then came the voice, distorted but unmistakable. It wasn't one voice but many, layered on top of each other, each whispering the same phrase, "We're still here." The boards began to creak, swelling under the pressure of something pushing from the other side. He stumbled back, terror gripping his chest as the sound of scraping filled the hallway. The glow dimmed abruptly, and then, for a few seconds, everything went silent again. The air felt colder than ever. He turned to leave, but before he could move, one of the nails holding the boards in place popped loose, clattering to the floor. Then another. Then another. Slowly, the boards began to shift outward, the door flexing as though something inside was breathing against it. The faint scent of earth and decay filled the air, and from the shadows of the hallway, a low whisper carried through the dark, his own voice, repeated back to him perfectly, asking, "Will you stay this time?" The last board cracked and fell to the floor, but when the landlord shone his flashlight toward the doorway, there was nothing but darkness, deep, endless, and waiting. The next morning, the landlord was gone. His office door stood open, the desk drawers pulled out, papers scattered across the floor, and a single key lying in the center of the room, the key to apartment 3B. The tenants whispered about hearing him pacing the halls late into the night, muttering to himself in a trembling voice. Some said they saw him standing outside the boarded door long after midnight, speaking softly as though answering someone on the other side. Others claimed they heard the door open, though no one dared to check. When dawn came, only silence remained. His car was still in the parking lot, his coat still hanging by the door, but the man himself had vanished without a trace. The building's caretaker, an old man who had worked there for years, took over his duties, but he refused to go near the third floor. He said the air there felt wrong, heavier somehow, as if the walls were holding their breath. Over the following weeks, strange things began happening again. Lights in the hallways flickered despite new bulbs being installed, and water stains appeared on the ceiling that no repair could erase. Tenants began hearing footsteps pacing above them at odd hours, though apartment 3B remained sealed and unoccupied. One night, a delivery boy reported seeing someone standing at the window of that apartment, staring down at the street. He described the figure as motionless, pale, and barely visible behind the curtain, but when the caretaker went up to check, the window was shut tight and covered in a layer of dust so thick that no one could have looked through it. Still, the shape of a handprint remained faintly visible on the glass. Rumors spread quickly. Some tenants believed the building itself was cursed, that it had absorbed the spirits of everyone who'd ever vanished within it. Others thought the landlord had gone mad and sealed himself inside the apartment, joining the voices that had been whispering for years. A few brave souls even tried to record the sounds at night, but every device malfunctioned the moment it was pointed toward the door. Audio files corrupted, batteries drained, and screens filled with static. Yet through that static, a pattern always emerged, 3 slow knocks followed by a faint, broken whisper. Eventually, the caretaker decided to move out, leaving behind a note warning anyone who came after him, "If you hear knocking, don't answer. It isn't asking to come in, it's asking you to stay." From that day forward, apartment 3B stood untouched, silent in the daylight but restless when night fell, waiting for its next voice to join the chorus within its walls.